My name is Edie McCoy Meeks. I have been a nurse for over 60 years, and part of my nursing career was in the Army Nurse Corps. And I served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. The reason I went to Vietnam was because my brother Tom had been drafted. Tom is 2 years younger than I am. We have kind of a special relationship anyway. And I thought, if they sent him over there and something happened to him, I'd want somebody over there who really wanted to be there. And I thought I can handle that. I've done intensive care. I've done emergency room nursing. I worked in British Columbia in a 46-bed hospital where you had to do everything. So I thought I was really prepared. I joined in February of 1968 and went to basic training, Fort Sam, Houston. And in July of 1968, I was sent to Vietnam and was assigned to the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon. And so I was inserted into the intensive care unit, where you were expected to just pick up and do whatever needed to be done. And what I didn't know, I just asked. But the patient load that we were getting was something that I had never seen before. And that was the most difficult part. All these kids that were coming in were my brothers. I mean, I could see their potential. I could see that they had families. I could see who they were. The average age was between 18 and 23. You saw kids come in with legs missing, arms missing, eyes missing. They were units out there, and they were very close to each other. And a lot of them were like, I've got to get back to my unit. And you knew they weren't going anywhere. They were going to go to Japan, and hopefully they would get better. Japan had a big Army hospital there, and it had many more facilities for surgery and recovery. By October, I was so filled with anger and rage toward the Army and toward our government, because it seemed as if they were just using up these boys. These boys were numbers to them. But to us, we knew they were people. I mean, we talked to them. They were ours. The one that haunted me was this kid. He was 19 years old. Now, I'm from Minnesota, and my Uncle Albert had a farm. And we would go down there in the fall to go pheasant hunting. And I just thought that was the best thing. And this kid came from a farm in Kansas, and he had a terrible abdominal wound. And he got a letter from his mother, and he said, "Would you read it to me?" And I said, "Sure." And it said, "Dear son, your dad just came in from pheasant hunting with the family dog, and chatting about the neighbors." And at the end, she said, "Son, we're so proud of you." And 3 days later, he died. And for me, the hardest part was not being able to get in touch with the parents to say I was there with him. I knew he wasn't alone. Around December and January, some of the people in the intensive care unit were leaving. Now, one of the things that I would say about being in Vietnam is I have never seen teamwork, the likes of which you saw over there. Everybody was working for the main goal, which was to get these guys as stable as we could and as well as we could, and to save as many lives as we could. And some of the team members were leaving, and I thought, well, I don't want to be left here alone for all new people to come in. So I asked for a transfer. So then I moved to Pleiku in January. And there I met Diane Carlson Evans, who is founder of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. She and I were hooch mates. And a hooch is a building that we lived in. There we wore fatigues, and if you worked nights, 7 to 7, you had to take your flak jacket and your helmet, because that's when you were rocketed most times. And we were. You sign up for 2 years in the Army. And so the first 6 months was basic training in Fort Ord. Then I went to Vietnam for a year, and I still had 6 months left before I was discharged from the Army. So when you leave Vietnam, we were told by the incoming nurses, whatever you do, as soon as you get stateside, take your uniform off because you are not going to have a welcome. This was July of 1969. And there was a lot of anti-war sentiment. And again, as often happens, they blamed the wrong person. They were blaming the soldiers who went over there. They should have been stomping their feet at the congressmen and senators and president who sent everybody over there. A lot of these guys were drafted. So when I got back to the States, nobody asked me, what was it like? So then I went to Tacoma, Washington, Fort Lewis, at Madigan General Hospital for 6 months. And I did intensive care unit there. So then you leave the Army. Now, back then, they didn't give you a physical. They didn't do anything. I went back to Minnesota. I got married and moved to New York. 6 months before, I had been in Vietnam, and all of a sudden, I'm living in New York. It wasn't until years later that I thought to myself, why was I not able to connect? Because I just sat in the apartment, and I didn't know what was wrong, that I was afraid to go outside. Eventually, I got a job at New York Hospital in an outpatient clinic, which was good because it wasn't anything like I had been doing, and it was 5 days a week. We lived there for 2 years. I got pregnant. We had our first little girl. This was in 1973. 15 months later, I had our son, and it was about, I would say, a year and a half after that I decided I had to go back to work. I love being a nurse. And I thought, for my sanity, that's part of who I am. I really need to be who I am. So I worked at the little local hospital, Butterfield Hospital. I worked in the operating room for about 25 years. I was getting worse and worse, and I didn't know that I was. It was the kind of thing where I can remember one time driving down the road. You were on call, and I was called in for an accident that had happened that we were going to have to do surgery on. And I was driving down the road, and I thought, if I just drove into that tree, I wouldn't have to worry anymore. I was trying to control everything in my life because inside everything was spinning out of control. The thing that really started me healing was my daughter was in college at the time. She went to Mount Holyoke, which is an all-women's college. And they had a fellow there who taught a course on Vietnam. And he started the course by saying, you women will never know what it's like to be at war. And when she heard that, she called me up and she said, Mom, you've got to come up here. And she said, I'm going to ask my professor if you can talk. And I said, well, if he says yes, I'll come up. And so I went up. I think it was because I was speaking in front of young women who were used to listening to women. I didn't have to explain why I was there. The feeling that you got was, of course you're here. Of course you speak. And I told them, I don't know about the politics, but I'll tell you what it felt like to be a woman over there. And at the very end, this little gal came up to me and she said, oh, Mrs. Meeks, I would have welcomed you home. That night, I went back to my hotel room and I called Diane. And this was like in 1992, I think. And she said, Edie, I have known you since 1969, and we have never talked about Vietnam. And from then on, we just kept talking. And I was on the board of directors of the Vietnam Women's Memorial for 25 years. And I did go to the VA. They had no idea what to do with me. They gave me this very fine young man. He and I worked together to figure out what PTSD was in a woman who served over there. And it worked. I was put on the right medications. I saw him regularly. I could call him anytime. When I had a flashback while I was driving, I called him right away. The flashback happened because of music that was on. That was really a trigger for me. There's no way I could have even talked about anything for the first 20 years. And a lot of the gals had said the same thing. But a lot of us just tucked it away. But then as life went on, it started bubbling up. And when it bubbles up, there's no stuffing it away anymore. And I find too that even though it's painful, it's less painful to face everything than to try and keep that lid on it. One of the things that happened to me as I was getting better, because I've been in a 12-step program. I happened to go to a program, and at the end, this woman came up to me and she said, Edie, you don't ever have to get over it. And that was such a relief to hear. Because I think I was working to, and when finally it doesn't bother me at all, it's always going to bother me. No one can prepare anyone for being a nurse during a war because you see things you can't even think of. You can't envision. And you become involved emotionally because these are people. This isn't a film that you're watching. You're holding their hand, you're, talking to them, you're encouraging them. Even though that year changed my life 100%, I would do it again in a heartbeat. And every nurse that I have talked to that served over there said the same thing.